Hello Internet, I'm the Disney Brain and we're almost there guys. Finally, we've reached the third and final installment of RPM, the Nearly Perfect Season. So, let us continue our discussion of the characters before breaking down the back end plot lines and the season in its entirety. And we'll start by addressing the good doctor herself. Dr. K for me easily represents the peak of non-fighter franchise characters. The angle of guilt and trying to redeem herself works perfectly here, and is a perfect conduit for everything we see from her. Dr. K herself says there's a reason for everything she does, and she couldn't be more right. Through her devastating backstory, we understand her mentality on almost everything, and can easily infer the rest. Dr. K forced the world to change, and in doing so, forced herself to change, because the world needed her to fix her biggest mistake. And by forcing herself to grow emotionally, it connects to another point about RPM. It's something I touched on when we talked about Ziggy and his importance. Venjix and his forces are machines, and their reign of terror literally turned Dr. K into one, just a voice on a computer screen. Not too far removed from Venjix himself initially. Then, she reclaims her own humanity by slowly opening up to her Ranger family. In the end, humanity is saved by embracing humanity. For Dr. K, that's represented by embracing Ziggy, and not by becoming more cold and bitter. For that reason, I think RPM does as good a job as Lost Galaxy in terms of utilizing the narrative differences between the two factions to ultimately decide the fight, because in both cases, there was meaning given to how both sides responded to change and tragedy. Doc K says it best: we all make mistakes, but if we don't learn from them, we pay twice. We all know how otherworldly intelligent the Doctor is, but that single lesson is the most important thing she's ever learned. And that's in spite of all the crap Alphabet Soup forced her to do, otherwise known as literal child abductors. But what works so well about their inclusion is the details, not just the faceless people, but faceless people who act and sound so jovial, so high-spirited, and so forthcoming, almost like preschool teachers, all in an effort to convince their young subjects that they're the ones to be trusted. It doesn't get much eerier, much creepier than that. And on top of that, the scummy bastards literally would not let Dr. K have her cake and eat it too. Speaking of Alphabet Soup, let us now discuss Gem and Gemma. Let's get the initial perceptions out of the way now. Yes, they do that annoying twin thing where they complete each other's sentences, and yes, they are quite childlike and as a result very rash, playful, and impulsive, but everything they are is exactly what they should be, which brings us back to the most evil thing about this show. Even though Gem and Gemma are never seen directly speaking to the Alphabet Soup reps, you'll notice that their tone of voice is very similar to that of the twins. I don't think that's happenstantial, which makes what we don't know equally as uncomfortable to think about as what we do. This think tank actively kept its prisoners from developing or maturing on top of straight up lying to them about why they can never leave, and the end result created twins that never had the chance to grow past an infant-like state of dependence and a high affinity for explosions. Which is why I think calling them just annoying or grating is a drastic oversimplification of who Gem and Gemma really are. When it comes right down to it, their state of being is nothing short of devastating. Both of them are geniuses when it comes to inventing and combat, but everything about them socially has been forcibly trapped underneath layer after layer of the outlandishly cruel things Alphabet Soup put them through. Alright, that was like an 11. I'm gonna bring it back down now. It's just a show. We're okay. And let's keep going. I would have loved to see a focus episode just about them, like what we got with the others, because that would have elevated their status as characters immensely. But as is, I've got nothing but love for the pair. Sure, they can be a bit much, there's no denying that, but at least we know why. Was Dax Lowe ever a victim of a secret government organization? Nope, didn't think so. Which brings us to Big Daddy Virus himself, the unfortunate result of one girl's wish to simply go outside. The simplicity of the reasoning really brings it all into perspective. Billions dead, and all it took was a hardened heart and a few keystrokes. I mentioned before that Venjix had to hustle that much harder than any Ranger villain ever because of the weight of his accomplishments. He more than delivers. He doesn't just send robots down, he sends a plan down. He doesn't just force others to fight the Rangers for him, he steps into the field himself multiple times. Because while his old bag of tricks might have worked when he invaded Spain or Canada, for example, there's no Power Rangers in either country, as far as we know. So, Venjix had to adjust his tactics specifically for Corinth. This also had the added benefit of eliminating one very viable question. Why don't Ranger villains attack more than one city? Strange, right? How in most seasons, they usually focus on a place or places that the Rangers can easily access. But here, that question is answered. There's nowhere else to attack. Despite Venjix being a virus, he is very much an emotionally driven machine. Look no further than Heroes Among Us, where Venjix acts with haste and overconfidence, leading to his defeat at the hands of Scott. He also has generals with distinct personalities, including Crunch, who is clearly missing a few bolts. Why would he do that? The same reason he experimented on humans in the first place, to understand his enemy better. Being able to infect computers is one thing, but being able to predict how humans will react to that, that's what wins wars. Even Venjix himself states that being part human is needed to fight humans. These writers thought of damn near everything. Venjix also implants his own tech into several humans, including two major characters. This sets up his endgame, where, fittingly enough, a partly robotic army of humans would help him wipe out the rest of humanity. He's very Ultron-like in that way, demanding a poetic victory as opposed to a plain one. In the end, he loses and humanity is restored. But, remember all that talk of immortality? Uh-oh. A perfect setup for the sequel we sadly never got. Or should I say, never got yet? At the end of the day, the best villains in Power Rangers force the Rangers themselves to be more to stop them. Mix that in with the narrative of stoic machines versus feeling humans, and Venjix helps make this season one of the greatest ever. Before we discuss Dylan and Tanaya, let's wrap up a few key plot points related to them. In the aftermath of Gem and Gemma's arrival and subsequent inclusion on the team, we continue along Dylan's path of trying to locate his long-lost sister. This gives us another really great Beyond the Dome episode where a Venjix factory is successfully dismantled. Before the raid, Gem and Gemma inform Dylan that they knew of a prisoner that could be his sister. The plots in several episodes after the fact continue to work in that information, even when it's not the immediate focus. And after a few less continual episodes, everything comes to a head in Key to the Past, wherein we arrive at the least unexpected twist of them all. Turns out, Tanaya is Dylan's sister, and the most human-looking of all of Venjix's soldiers is actually human. Surprise? Once she stops trying to fight against the truth, she realizes that helping the Rangers is the way to go. But then, on her super secret mission, she gets captured and turned evil again. Curious. Something seems familiar about all this. Alright. Time to address the elephant in the plot. Yes, even within the context of everything RPM is doing, and doing well, the way Tanaya is handled on the back end of the season is pretty lazy. In Space was the peak of Zordon-era Power Rangers. Everyone's gonna notice the rehashed plot points. And even as a direct comparison goes, Astronema's story blows Tanaya's out of the water. Nobody had any reason to suspect that Astronema was anyone's sister when she was first introduced, but Dylan's missing sister was a plot point before he officially joined the team, so as soon as Tanaya appeared, any sense of suspense goes right out the window. And that's on top of how patient In Space was in cultivating this particular story thread. But, more than anything, the whole situation is just confusing to me. A season that could do no wrong throughout most of its run, and one of the biggest subplots is the Power Rangers equivalent of Starkiller Base. I don't dislike it, and Tanaya is still a pretty good character, but the whole situation is very anti-RPM. Because every other aspect thereof was handled with such ingenuity, creativity, and with just the right mix of dark realism, self-referential humor, and the tones both created. This whole thing could have been saved if you had Flynn throw in a line about how he read about this very conundrum somewhere before. We know he's an avid reader of comic books, and Ninja Storm implies that said comics might apply to the Rangers too. Then, it would have at least fit into the general structure of RPM. This whole thing was more on Judd Lin than anything, since Eddie Gazillion's original draft was reportedly not going to have Tanaya be the reveal. Now let's break down the sibling pair as characters, starting with Tanaya. As I mentioned, I still consider Tanaya a good character, even if she is a bit underwhelming with the reveal, but it's interesting that both her and Dylan have such snarky, almost self-aware commentary towards the Rangers. What works best about Tanaya, though, is her contemplation regarding her own humanity. That's a theme we keep coming back to, and when RPM made that her focal point, it really worked. And even though Astronema is best villain forever, the way certain Tanaya plot points are utilized here, however familiar, do make sense given her hybrid nature, and in some cases make more sense for that same reason. That at least makes her struggle distinct from Caron's, who is less about the idea of humanity and more about choice, overcoming one's past, and the not so simple nature of good and evil. And finally, let's talk about Dylan before discussing RPM's final moments. Dylan is an extremely well-conceived character that works in so many ways. The innovative nature of having a story centered around the Black Ranger, the intriguing mystery surrounding why Venjix wanted human experiments, and most notably, the way he challenges and/or relates to almost every character present. With Summer, the pairing is superbly done and feels as naturally cultivated as any Ranger relationship ever. With Ziggy, we can infer what protecting him means to Dylan, and how connecting with both him and Summer helps Dylan down his own road of humanization. With Scott and Dr. K, you get the challenge, and the idea permeates throughout the entire season. Ironically enough, Dylan didn't want to be part of any team at first, but his presence made most of the members of said team much better. Dr. K might still be a talking screen if Dylan didn't question her, and for a year, the original three worked within the city limits. It's only after getting a bunch of pushback from his new Black Ranger that Scott started demanding more from himself and his team. That can't be happenstance, and that idea also permeates throughout the team. A team where there's always someone challenging someone else. A team where first impressions are far from the only impressions. A team that made each other better, with Dylan as the catalyst. So even though it doesn't seem like Dylan's character breakdown is as extensive as the others, he was as necessary to the greatness of RPM as anyone here, because it was his influence that allowed the other characters to improve so much, in addition to unveiling new layers and facets to their personalities, and they all needed that improvement to stop Venjix's final plan, which leads us to Endgame, wherein Venjix activates every infected human inside Corinth. The most captivating part about the heightened tension of the final episodes are the great character exchanges we get. Ziggy and Dylan have a nice little moment of friendship. Colonel Truman listens to Scott and gives him the unimpeded authority to lead their new plan, and Venjix speaks to his creator for the first time in a long time, giving us the wonderfully potent flawed humans over machines line that so perfectly captures the season. Venjix as a villain is always building to something, always planning, adjusting, and planning some more. Venjix's endgame and the two-part finale that came from it was good for two main reasons. One, we understand both the practicality and the symbolism at play, with Venjix using more robotic humans to finish the fight. And two, he goes one step further than Thrax ever did. He used his viral nature to literally delete the Rangers and their Zords, who are all connected to the same morphing grid. It was the perfect ending specifically for Venjix, who rose to power by hacking entire national militaries and economies, so ending things by going after the source of all Ranger power is a well thought out conclusion. Not surprisingly, it's here where RPM gets back on track with the Tanaya stuff too, since her reconversion made a lot more sense than Andros' magical tears. And then they wisely use her hybrid nature to turn the tables on Venjix by undeleting the fallen Rangers. And finally, Venjix is destroyed. Except not, because as we know, while he was messing around with the biofield, he found a way to download himself into the Operator Red Morpher. Plenty of villains claim that they're unbeatable, invincible, immortal even. Venjix proved himself right. For as good as the season finale was though, I wouldn't call it as exceptional as the series itself. I just can't shake the feeling that something was missing from it. It all seems to add up, and the ending makes sense, both in terms of themes and plot progression, and the brilliant reference to episode 1 with the life restored symbolism was spot on here. But as a whole, it felt a little incomplete. Honestly, what I think they should have done is taken another page from the In Space playbook. Hear me out on this one. The triumph of humanity represents the core of this season, so given that, if they were to have created a unique version of the legendary I'm a Power Ranger 2 scene, it would have worked. The Rangers had to go beyond themselves and look beyond the dome to finally win the day, realizing that just curling up in a ball won't stop Venjix. So it would make perfect sense for the humans they protected that weren't infected to do the same. Imagine that little girl from the bus scene coming back to remind a broken down Flynn that he's still a hero after Gem and Gemma get deleted. Imagine the vets from Heroes Among Us showing up when Scott needs a hand, ideally doing something A-Team like, that'd be cool. And then Summer's parents and friends join in, finally recognizing the importance of this fight. Maybe they throw their expensive possessions at some attack bots, symbolizing that very point. Then Fresno Bob gathers all the cartels and they all join in to help Ziggy and Dr. K. And since they are the cartels, give them some awesome but very illegal weapons to bust out. But have the Yo-Yo Brothers cartel fight with real yo-yos, just because that would be funny. All of that would be similar to, but also a unique take on what Countdown did. But here's the best part. Because in this case, it would have been everyone who the team helped as humans and not necessarily as Rangers. And that is one thing Venjix absolutely cannot and can never delete or defeat. But even still, Danger and Destiny is pretty good as is. I just think it needed a bit more kick to it, something more resonating. And so, we finally arrive at the season breakdown. RPM is the single most ambitious season of Rangers ever made. It takes risks, it takes chances, and the only time it really felt lacking is when they reused old plot points or played things safe. But the things it does right, it does so right that it's hard to call it anything short of a top 3 season. Every layer it has comes with an additional layer underneath. Almost every character feels like a complete person in their own right, and the handful that don't are that way because of the smartly conceived reasons for it the story gives us. This season challenges the franchise in ways that it needed to be challenged. It doesn't do it out of spite, it doesn't do it out of ill will, but rather from a place of understanding. It wasn't just a more mature season because it was darker in tone. It was a more mature season because it knew what to question and how to answer those questions. But then they take it one step further by utilizing those same answers to drive certain plots. Look no further than Flynn using background explosions to take out enemies for a change. Practical applications of Ranger tropes in a way that felt functional and rarely if ever dipped into the realm of complete parody. But even then, RPM proves to be one of the funnier seasons too. The crazy thing to think about is how Eddie Gazillion was fired before RPM could finish. He was a perfectionist, he was a budget burner, and probably a bit of a megalomaniac, so to an extent, I understand why Disney fired him, but it's hard to argue against what he was able to do. He assured Disney of something spectacular before he even watched Goanger, and he felt that he might not be able to deliver because googly anime-eyed Zords. All that, on top of the fact that his bosses did not care one way or the other. But then, Eddie figured it out. The googly eyes, the aesthetically questionable Zords, it all goes back to Dr. K, because her Zords are both functional and toy-like in design, a seamless blend of Dr. K's personal stagnation and intellectual maturity. While the twins act like children overtly, Dr. K embraces the childhood she never really got internally, and it only becomes external through her inventions and snacking habits. In short, Eddie Gazillion figured out how to make a teddy bear car viable by tying it back into the psychology of the character who made it. It's nothing short of brilliant. Having worked with Disney Channel prior to Power Rangers, Eddie's influence bled over to the casting side of things as well, namely with Rose McIver and Ari Boylan, both of whom had been in DCOMs before suiting up. He also had an eye for cultivating talent, and gave us some of the best actors and acting of any Ranger season. It's no coincidence that both Rose and Eka Darville are still somewhat prominent today. Eddie's firing completely changed certain aspects of the season. As I mentioned, Tanaya was not originally going to be Dylan's sister, and Dylan was going to have a larger role in the finale, but despite those setbacks, the showrunners that survived or were brought on kept the season strong and character focused. But it's interesting to think about how much different, and likely, how much better the season could have been with a consistent voice throughout all of filming. In the end, what it all comes down to is just how fresh and original RPM was, in addition to being a very high quality entry in the series. The most noteworthy seasons are noteworthy because they made their uniqueness work. And even when there are interesting ideas that get screwed up like with Overdrive, at least there's a sense of innovation there. A sense that this franchise can be anything it wants to be, so long as the characters are well realized and the plot adds up. It's a lesson the Neo Saban era desperately needs to learn. And hopefully they'll learn it before Go Busters gets adapted, because nobody wants to see the Power Rangers ruin a potential RPM sequel. If they botch that, there might not be enough fans left over for when we finally go back to space, whenever that ends up being. Eddie Gazillion cared too much about getting this season just right. He cared too much about the details and the narrative. We need Power Rangers showrunners who care too much again. That said, I have no clue what they were thinking with this theme song. It's impossibly bad. In closing, even with a 3-part analysis now complete, there is still so much to say, so much to potentially talk about, so many more layers to uncover, as is the nature of RPM. And after spending who even knows how many minutes discussing this season, that more than anything is the biggest takeaway. I could tell you about the themes, the characters, and how they beautifully intersect until your ears fall off. But in the end, there will always be more to say, more perspectives than what I alone could possibly provide. And part of that discussion could be what exactly happened inside that alternate reality once Venjix re-emerged, and will Beast Morphers address that? What are the true origins of Professor Cog from the Samurai crossover? And maybe, the most morally complex question the season poses, who's really to blame? Venjix was the villain here, but Dr. K still created him, and you guys fully understand my feelings regarding Alphabet Soup. The answer is neither obvious nor straightforward, as is the case with many aspects of this season. Discourse and dialogue is a powerful thing, and in my opinion, the most important thing we can take away from any piece of media. And I don't think there will ever be a more discussion-worthy season than this one. I don't know if I'd call RPM the best season. My mind says maybe, but my heart says nuh-uh. But it's a damn near perfect one. And that was RPM, an extremely lengthy thematic analysis. Next on the docket, literally anything else, because I am not trying to jump back into another whole season right away. I'm sure you can all understand that. Eventually, we'll continue the countdowns and discuss the 10 best Blue Rangers, or supporting characters, whichever comes first. But before any of that, I was recently inspired to make a new film review that's sure to be jam-packed with nostalgia. It's not Rangers, but I'll give you a hint. Monsters are the main attraction, so stay tuned for that. And as always, thanks for watching.